The early morning ocean wind blew fiercely. It seeped into the wrinkled skin of George Miller, a 77-year-old veteran standing silently at the California harbor. In front of him stood a small table. On it lay a wreath of remembrance and a faded old photograph of the comrades who had fallen. But then, a mocking laugh cut through the stillness, followed by the sharp thud of a plastic water bottle striking the memorial table. A group of young locals had gathered, sneering, "Your memorial is pointless. Who even remembers those people anymore?" George said nothing. His hands gripped the photo frame tightly. His eyes fought back the tremble. The old wounds, never truly healed, had just been insulted in broad daylight. But just 1 hour later, the sky above thundered with the sound of descending helicopter blades. And what happened next left the entire town speechless. Can loyalty and memory still awaken the conscience of a community that has long forgotten? If you believe some stories must be told, subscribe to the channel and let us know where and when you're watching from. Under the dim light of dawn, George Miller walked slowly onto the familiar harbor. His hand held an old photograph frame, a white wreath, and a small candle. All had faded with the years, just like him. Every year, on this very day, he performed the ritual nobody asked for, nobody attended. But for him, it was sacred. It was the day to remember those who had sacrificed alongside him in war. He needed no soundtrack. He needed no reporters. He needed no praise. He simply stood there in the sea breeze before the small wooden table in profound silence. George had never been a man of many words. Since he was discharged, he lived quietly by the shore, silently repairing the old boat as if mending the torn fragments of his memory. He avoided crowds, not out of hatred, but because inside him the world still continued, a world of duty, loss, and loyalty. To George, the memorial ritual was not an event. It was a promise, and that promise he had never forgotten. But the town had changed. Old neighbors gradually moved away. In their place came a younger generation, swift, noisy, and unfamiliar with the old values. To them, George was just a strange old man who set up a memorial table at the harbor each year, as if it were a peculiar habit. They did not understand, and they did not want to. That morning, just as George bent his head to light the candle, a group of youths appeared. They walked up with casual indifference. Their mocking laughter was unhidden. One kicked over the wreath, another threw a water bottle at the memorial table, knocking the photograph askew. Taunts rang out. "What's this old man doing? This is a harbor, not a memorial." George did not react. Not a single word escaped his lips. He stood still. His hands trembled slightly, yet his gaze remained fixed on the photograph. No one could know that within that gaze raged a storm, silent, profound, but never ceasing to rise in his mind for over half a century. Rage did not erupt. Instead, it was a persistent ache. The ache of someone who had witnessed death up close, who had lost brothers in the 1970 storm, who had kept a lifelong promise to remember them, and now only scorn remained. George still did not speak, but his hand clenched tighter, not to resist, but to keep himself from breaking. It was not merely an insult to an old man. It was a denial of the memory of those who had fallen for this country. And amid the steady crash of waves, the sea breeze seeming colder than ever, George stood there, more alone than ever. But he knew, if today he did not stand here, then tomorrow no one would. And as the white wreath was trampled, he understood that memory, if not preserved, would be erased faster than anything. He did not shed a tear. But in that moment, his heart cracked a little, not because of the youth's actions, but because of the fear that the new generation had truly forgotten what had kept this country standing. When the last mocking laugh finally dissolved into the wind and the chaotic footsteps of the young group faded into the distance, the harbor returned to its familiar stillness. Only George remained, standing motionless like a stone statue. A gentle breeze swept through his silvered hair, carrying the brine of the sea, yet he did not move. In his hand, the old photograph was now blurred and streaked. It was impossible to tell whether the moisture was salt spray or tears, or perhaps both, mingled together as the years had blurred the line between life and sacrifice. That photograph was something he always carried. A black and white portrait of Charlie Company, taken just days before fate swept them into the furious 1970 storm. George, then a young lieutenant just beginning to understand the cost of leadership, had been tasked with leading an urgent rescue mission offshore. The unexpected storm had erupted. The sea roiled with violent waves, and in the dimming darkness, he guided a small team into the heart of the tempest to save those trapped on a stricken ship. They had succeeded. 12 sailors were brought home safely, but 3 of his closest comrades, Tom, Raymond, and Ellis, never returned. They vanished beneath the waves, and with them, a part of George never made it back to shore. From that moment on, he had vowed to himself that their memory would never be forgotten. He could not save them, but he could keep them alive in every year, every day. And this memorial, at this humble harbor, was all he had left to honor that promise. Yet today, that sacred place had been torn apart by indifference, by callousness, and by contempt. The kick that sent the wreath crashing, the sharp crack of the bottle against the table, the mocking jeers, all of it cut through him like a cold blade, not on his skin, but deep within his heart. George sank onto the wooden bench, not from exhaustion, but because an emptiness was rising like a tide in his chest. He rested the photograph on the small table, slowly placed both hands on his knees, and stared out at the water. The sea still rippled, the breeze still whispered. The sun had risen and cast long shadows along the seawall. But inside George, time had stopped. Memories returned silently, as if replaying every moment of that fateful day. He heard the screams crackling over the radio, saw again the flickering lights of the rescue ship, and felt the cold hand of Raymond slipping from his grip. Now, the harbor's silence became a space for grief to stir. A bitter sigh escaped his chest. He was no longer angry, only hollowed by a deeper fear that what he had kept alive for so long might vanish with time, with a generation that no longer cared about the past. He sat there, unmoving, nearly merging with the surroundings as if he himself were part of the harbor, the sea, the memory. An hour passed in silence. Only the wind sighed and the waves whispered at his feet. No one came. No one returned. And he expected nothing more. But then, a sound cut through the stillness. At first, faint, then steadily growing. Helicopter rotor blades slicing through the air from afar. George lifted his head. His ears, accustomed to battlefield engines, recognized that sound immediately. Helicopters. And not just one. The noise grew louder. The downwash from the rotors began churning the water's surface, creating ripples that seemed to quiver with anticipation, as if heralding something about to unfold. He could hardly believe his eyes. Time seemed to freeze in that moment. George sprang to his feet, his hand instinctively clutching the photograph. He gazed upward at the sky, now reverberating with sound. And then, on the horizon, dark silhouettes shaped like steel wings appeared, sweeping in with the authority, the strength, and the precision of a military formation. George's vision blurred with fresh moisture, not from the sea breeze, but because he knew this was no coincidence. This was the answer to the vow he had held for more than half a lifetime. And at last, someone had listened. The roar of the helicopter engines did more than shatter the harbor's silent calm. It stirred the water's surface like a reflex from memories long buried. Every gaze snapped upward, toward 3 military helicopters, painted navy gray, advancing toward the shore in a disciplined formation, as if even the sky itself bowed before what was about to unfold. The rotor wash swept across the grass, kicking up clouds of dust. Each powerful turn of the blades not only shook the air, but made the hearts of onlookers pound fiercely. They did not understand what was happening. Moments ago, this place had been a desecrated memorial. Now, it had become the focal point of an unexpected, solemn event, heavy with significance. The lead MH-60R Seahawk touched down first, its fuselage caked with dust like a steel bird emerging from military history. The rotors slowed, leaving behind a tense hush. And then, the door swung open. A young pilot stepped out, helmet firmly held in his hand. He strode forward on ground still vibrating from the rotor's echo. His flight suit was crisp, perfectly fitted, but it was his eyes that made everyone pause. Eyes sharp and resolute, yet carrying a rising wave of emotion. This was not the gaze of an officer merely executing orders. It was the gaze of a grandson, facing something sacred to his family. His name was Ryan Miller. To those who knew George, that surname was familiar, but few guessed that this young naval aviator with an impressive record was the very grandson George had quietly taken pride in for all these years. Ryan advanced without a word. His steps were measured but weighted with meaning. Each footfall seemed to carry understanding and profound feeling. The harbor air felt as though it had solidified. The townspeople who had jeered just moments before now stood silent, eyes fixed on the young serviceman approaching the solitary old man they once dismissed as an odd relic. George remained rooted in place, his frame leaning slightly in the breeze, the old photo clutched tightly in his hand. When he saw Ryan, surprise flickered across his face. It was a fleeting moment, insufficient to grasp everything, yet enough to bring tears to his eyes. No words were exchanged. No explanation was needed. In that simple nod shared between 2 generations lay something deeper than 1,000 words, a continuation, a validation, a recognition. Ryan came to a halt before his grandfather, then executed a crisp military salute. It was not a perfunctory gesture. It was a salute to a man who had sacrificed quietly, never seeking recognition. It was a salute from the present generation to the memory of a generation that had passed. None in the crowd knew that Ryan had long followed his grandfather's journey. In brief emails, in intermittent phone calls, he was aware of George's annual memorial ritual. Yet it was the brief video circulating online, capturing the jeering, the knocked-over wreath, George's stony gaze, that awakened something he could not ignore. Ryan could not let the man who had instilled in him courage, principles, and a spirit of service stand alone in lonely obscurity. Nor could he allow the fallen, those who once fought at his grandfather's side on the open seas, to be insulted by a generation's indifference. He did not send letters. He did not call the media. He did not post statements on social platforms. He chose to appear, in the manner of a true serviceman, a warrior living by the values he believed in, and by that presence, he forced the entire town to pause, to look again, to ask themselves, how oblivious have we become? Ryan's arrival was more than a personal act. It was a wake-up call, a silent yet weighty declaration. The past cannot be erased simply because the present generation is too busy to remember, and that those who sacrificed, who preserved freedom itself, deserve gratitude through respect, not pity. On that seemingly ordinary morning, the entire harbor witnessed something extraordinary, and George, for the first time in many years, was no longer standing alone. Ryan walked slowly across the grass. His footsteps were swallowed by the fading echo of helicopter engines. The air around the harbor felt frozen. Every movement seemed to halt, and all eyes were fixed on him, an image of strength and steadiness, yet carrying an undying surge of emotion with every step. The breeze whipped through his flight jacket, carrying the salt of the sea and the breath of something sacred about to be revealed. George remained seated, leaning slightly forward as if the weight of the years pressed upon his shoulders. His eyes followed each step of his grandson. At first, surprise, then a silent release of nameless feeling, an intertwining of astonishment, confusion, and profound emotion. When Ryan stopped and stood at attention before him, a decisive gesture was made, the right hand raised in salute, that of one soldier honoring another. That moment seemed to stretch beyond the bounds of time allowed. George did not immediately return the salute. He gazed at the young man standing before him and saw a reflection of himself from half a century ago, those same determined eyes, that same resolute heart, but now carrying something he had never dared to dream, witnessing the next generation continuing what he had begun. A single tear rolled down his cheek, not from pain, but from something he had feared would never come: recognition. Ryan lowered his hand and turned toward the crowd. His eyes glinted with the resolve of one who had stood firm under pressure, yet his voice was gentle, as if recounting a story that needed to be heard. All other sounds seemed to recede into the background, to make way for each word he spoke. "The man you mocked this morning," Ryan began, his voice steady but not cold, "led a rescue mission into the heart of a Pacific typhoon in 1970. My grandfather, then a young lieutenant, saved 12 sailors in circumstances everyone thought impossible." His voice was not loud, yet it resonated. Each word rang like a bell, awakening the listener's conscience, forcing them to see the silver-haired man seated there not as an eccentric old man, but as a living monument of courage. "Many of those sailors," he continued, "went on to return home, marry, raise families, and live the lives they should never have had, if not for my grandfather. But the price paid was the lives of his 3 closest friends, Tom, Raymond, and Ellis, who never came back." The wind seemed to still. In the crowd, faces changed expression. Some bowed their heads, others covered their eyes. Soft gasps and choked sobs began to ripple through the spectators, quiet, yet unmistakable. Ryan paused for a beat, inhaled deeply, then turned his gaze toward the small wooden table where the white wreath had been carefully replaced. "And since that day," he said, "my grandfather upheld a single promise. Each year, on this date, he comes here to honor them. He needs no witnesses. He needs no praise. He only needs to keep them remembered. He only needs to ensure they are not forgotten." A weighty silence enveloped the harbor. The onlookers stood motionless, no longer mere spectators, but witnesses to a shift in awareness, a painful turn from judgment to understanding. Then Ryan spoke his final words, his tone solemn and unwavering, carrying not only familial devotion, but the honor of the Navy. From today onward, this memorial ritual will no longer be a personal matter. The United States Navy officially recognizes this as an annual commemorative ceremony. There will be participation by active units. A flag will be hoisted, and the names will be called out as they deserve, with gratitude. No one laughed. No one spoke. Only the wind and the waves remained. Yet within that silence lay a tacit accord that from this moment everything had changed. Not because a squadron of helicopters had descended, but because one person dared to stand and speak the truth, a truth that humbled a community and turned a man once dismissed as peculiar into a symbol of undying loyalty. The news of that day spread like a storm. From the first posts on social media, within hours, the story of the veteran mocked, and then honored by a helicopter squadron, flooded every local news site. The poignant images, George seated beside his memorial table, his gaze as still as stone. Then the moment his grandson stood at attention before him amid the wind-swept harbor, touched the hearts of thousands. And soon, people began to arrive. The harbor, so silent for so many years, suddenly became a place of reverent footsteps. Townspeople who once passed George as if he were invisible now carried fresh bouquets, placing them beside the restored white wreath. The American flag was hoisted high. It billowed in the wind as if bowing to something more sacred than words. Simple banners stretched across the space, yet full of respect. "We are grateful. Thank you for your sacrifice." Where the grass had once been trampled by indifference, now bore footprints of remorse and atonement. There was no more scorn, no more mocking laughter, only silent gazes and whispered apologies among those standing close together, unsure how to begin saying they were sorry. The youths who had disrupted the memorial now stood quietly, arms held stiff at their sides, eyes fixed on the silver-haired man recounting his story. George did not harbor anger or bitterness. He did not cast blame. He recounted events calmly, not with a tone of reproach, but with the gentle cadence of one safeguarding cherished memories. Each sentence was like a prayer. Each name he spoke was like a small candle lit amid the winds of remembrance. He needed not many words. His very presence there, as in every year, was living testimony. But today, surrounded not by emptiness, but by attentive eyes, his voice deepened, melding with the sea's waves, with every detail he had carried in his heart for 50 years. And from that moment on, the memorial ceased to be the act of a solitary veteran. It became a community event, where the entire town shared responsibility for preserving history. They did not only honor the departed, they honored the very silence they had once overlooked. Ryan stayed another 3 days. He needed no press, no uniform, just a grandson who straightened the photo frame, replaced the wooden table, and together with his grandfather erected a small plaque bearing the names of the 3 fallen soldiers. The plaque was crafted from pine wood, hand-carved letters, each stroke meticulous, imbued with the love of 2 generations for those no longer called by name each day. In the small seaside house, the 2 sat side by side as dusk fell. Few words were spoken, and they needed none. For some things, the more they are spoken, the more their meaning fades. They simply sat, one who once saved lives amid the storm, and one who carried the responsibility to continue, and listened to the waves whisper outside the window. George did not ask when Ryan would return to his unit. Ryan did not ask if he would hold next year's memorial. Between them was an understanding that required no words, a lifeline flowing through war, through years, through silence. And in the fading evening light, George gazed out to sea. He no longer felt alone in the modern world. He no longer felt his memories forgotten. For the first time, he knew that someone would carry them forward. And after that someone, there would be many more. So long as even one person remembers, no one is ever truly lost to oblivion. The following summer, the harbor was no longer the place where just one man stood in silence. The second annual memorial since last year's events had now become an indispensable part of the town's rhythm of life. From early morning, small flags lined the entrance. White bouquets were arranged neatly around the memorial table, and solemn whispers echoed among the growing lines of people. George Miller, now 78 years old, stood amid the crowd like an aged pillar of time. In his hand was the old photograph, now carefully laminated and framed in polished wood, a way of telling the world that memory is not something to fade, but something to hold with both hands and both heart. His face remained serene as always, yet there was a difference. His eyes no longer bore the weight of loneliness from years past. They were lighter, deeper, and in a fleeting moment seemed to shine with the very faith he once believed he carried alone. Surrounding him were naval officers in crisp uniforms. Many had never met George, had never even heard his name in their textbooks, yet today they had come. They came to lay flowers. They came to stand in silence. They came to show George by their presence that what he had preserved for over half a century was not in vain. They came to speak the gratitude that those who could no longer speak would have voiced. In the front row stood school children in uniforms, holding a hand-painted banner. "Thank you for your sacrifice." The letters were scrawled unevenly, the ink smudged in places, but to George it was more beautiful than any printed slogan. In those strokes lay understanding, growth, and a promise that the next generation would not continue in ignorance. Ryan stood beside him, back straight, eyes fixed ahead where the flag was being raised slowly. His uniform was immaculate. The row of ribbons over his chest gleamed in the morning sun. But what made George most proud was not the uniform, but the way Ryan stood, silent, reverent, like a true sailor who had learned the most sacred lesson from his grandfather. Loyalty is not spoken aloud. It is kept by fulfilling one's promise. The mournful notes of the bugle rang out. The sound was not loud, but it was enough to make everything around them pause. The wind seemed to hold its breath. The waves lapped more softly, and the whole town fell into a silence that felt almost sacred. No phone was lifted. No one spoke. Only that sound, low and mournful, echoing far, seemed to touch each person, reminding them of names no longer present but never gone. George closed his eyes. In that darkness, he saw again the faces of those who had fought beside him, who had shared coffee in the watchtower between night shifts, who had laughed on the ship's deck before all were swept away by the storm with no return. But this time, the memory did not sting with cold. It felt like warm water flowing through his veins, reminding him, they are still here, in the bugle's notes, in Ryan's eyes, in the wreaths of strangers, in the gratitude of an entire community. And when the final note of the memorial bugle faded completely, George opened his eyes. He turned to Ryan without a word, but his gaze said it all. A thank you, a passing of trust, a belief at last given its rightful place. In that moment, George knew he was no longer alone. He had fought his whole life not to be celebrated, but to ensure that the memories of those who sacrificed would not be buried. And now, he could rest his shoulders lightly. because a new generation had risen to continue that promise. The white wreaths were no longer mere symbols of the past. They had become the pledge of the present, that no one is truly forgotten if even one person remembers. And today, more than one person remembered. An entire community did. The final lesson of this story does not lie in medals or applause. It lies in the quiet persistence of a man who, year after year, stepped onto this harbor with only a photograph and a single candle. For sometimes, one person standing silently is enough to move an entire world. If you also believe that loyalty and memory are real strengths, please share this story. Subscribe to the channel to help us spread values that never grow old, and let them live on through each generation, each telling, each wreath laid with all our gratitude.